Welcome to the Department of Healthcare Access and Information HCAI 2022 California Building Standard Triennial Code Cycle Updates presentation, brought to you by the Building Standard Unit here at HCAI. The California Code has updates every 3 years, so hold on tight and prepare to learn about some of the changes that have been made to the 2022 California Building Standard Code for the electrical portion, the Part 3 of the Building Code. You can find the handout ready to download for your use at the Handout tab on the Go To panel. The length of this presentation is from 9 a.m. to 10:30, but may end early depending on how many questions you have. Now, what about the questions? If you have a question during the presentation, please type it into the question section of the Go To panel, and we will answer those questions at the end of the presentation the best we can. Please keep your questions generic, but if you have a project-specific question, please send it to regsunit@hcai.ca.gov, spelled REGSUNIT@hcai.ca.gov. If the presentation experiences transmission difficulties, don't be frustrated. Please log out and log back in by using the same login information sent by the GoTo software when you register for the presentation. Today, for presenter, we have Jamie Schnick, Senior Electrical Engineer and Technical Lead here at HCAI. Once again, thank you for joining us. So Jamie, if you're there, I hand the presentation over to you.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Jamie Schnick with HCAI. As mentioned, we're going to go through the CEC 2022 changes. To start off with this first slide, I'll just go through kind of the color code. What I've tried to do is highlight in yellow what's new, and then I've highlighted in blue topics that I want to make sure that we discuss. So the 2022 NEC had a number of changes. There was a bunch of changes that dealt with GFCI protection, and we'll go over those. You'll see those in various parts of the code. There's also a number of areas where the code was adding in new material to keep up with current technology. So here in Article 90, where the scope is identified, it talks about, it adds in what's covered, installations for shore power to ships, which we're not too interested in, but item 6, installation used to export electrical power from vehicles to premises wiring, or for bidirectional current flow. So this is kind of one of the themes I was talking about. The code is taking into account the new technologies and evolving to address that. Just as a kind of a reset the table, in the beginning, in the same article, the purpose of the code and the purpose of our efforts to enforce the code is for practical safeguarding. So there's a disclaimer. The purpose of this code is the practical safeguarding of persons and property from hazards arising from the use of electricity. This code is not intended as design specification or an instruction manual for untrained persons. So here at HCAI, we're here to help. Sometimes we're asked to help with the design and we'll give our opinions, but really we're here as an enforcement agency. And our goal is to be consistent with our enforcement, be appropriate with our enforcements of the code. And so we're starting these seminars to share our approach. Definitions. There's a new definition, or the definition for accessible as it applies to equipment was revised. One thing I want to make clear is that there's 3 definitions of accessible in the code. One is as it applies to wiring methods, and that accessible means that it's capable of being removed or exposed without damaging the building structure. This accessible as it applies to equipment is capable of being reached for operation, renewal, and inspection. So you'll see up above what it used to say, and now the new wording. So essentially, ladder access is okay. Behind locked doors still is accessible. Adjacent to equipment, if individuals need to set down their tool belts or their code books and climb over equipment to get to the equipment, to the electric equipment, is still accessible. The equipment still is required to have the code mandated clear workspaces, but the access is certainly not restricted to just being able to walk up to. The other accessible definition, readily accessible, which is capable of being reached quickly for operation, renewal, or inspection. So just to clarify, this change is for accessible as it relates to equipment. Coordination. So in definitions under the California Code, we added this definition of coordination. This helps us in our discussions about the coordination is required in 517.31G, which is coordinate overcurrent protection devices required to be coordinated for faults that have a duration of over 1/10 of a second. And so we're adding this definition to distinguish between coordination and full coordination, which the code identifies as selective coordination. CEC 100 in general, we'll see that they've added the fuel cell system, generating capacity, island mode. So all these terms kind of geared around the concept of microgrids. Labeling. This informational note was added that while equipment needs to be labeled, if a listed product is of such a size, shape, or material, or the surface texture that it's not possible to apply a label, that the labeling can appear in the packaging. So this is for our field staff. Labeling and packaging is acceptable. Approval. So we'll see that these, we've always had the requirement, equipment is approved if it's listed by a national recognized testing laboratory. We've also added in, when field evaluated, equipment is evaluated and labeled by a field evaluation body accredited by the International Accreditation Services. So typically, or frequently, there's large equipment that's manufactured outside our country that is on site and needs to be labeled, but doesn't have, it's not labeled before it reaches site. So this is basically given the requirements of how that field labeling can be accomplished and what accreditations are required. Torque, terminal connections. So this has always been a requirement. There's a few informational notes that were added in the National Electrical Code. Examples of torque would mean of means of achieving the indicated torque would be torque tools or devices, shear bolts, breakaway. The informational note identifies that the equipment manufacturer can be contacted if the torque values aren't clear. And then it also points you to NFPA 70B, which has recommended practice for electrical equipment maintenance. I added in this slide, essentially, this is from EC&M 2023, the 10 most commonly cited electrical code violations. One of them is to do with torque. And this is an excerpt from that article that basically says at a conference, trade show conference with seasoned electricians, attendees were given the opportunity to tighten electrical terminations with a standard wrench, and generally it was determined that a number of these terminations were under torqued. So what does that mean for us? Obviously, when people look at torquing, they think about the big conductors, the big lugs, but the requirement is for branch circuit wiring for receptacles. And so I think the best way to accomplish that is to make sure that there is a recently calibrated torque tool on site and that a procedure is in place to properly torque terminations. Requirements for electrical installations. We've always had the requirement that the disconnecting means would either need to be obvious of what it serves or have a label that indicates the equipment that it is connected to. What's new is that these disconnects, and I actually just have a box there, but I use that for graphics, that not only did they show the piece of equipment, in this case, air conditioner unit number 6, but it also shows the source. So this is a new requirement that the marking shall include the identification of the circuit source that supplies the disconnecting means. 110.24, available fault current. Essentially, they've added in the requirement. We always have the same requirement. Service equipment will need to be legibly marked with available short circuit, including the date it was calculated. They add in, when modifications to electrical installation occur that affect available fault current, that they shall be recalculated, re-verified, and then, if necessary, remarked. So in the theme of evolving technology, we're seeing more and more photovoltaics, fuel cells that are connected and parallel with the normal system. These are fault current contributors, and when those projects occur, that recalculation would be required, and relabeling. We talked about ground fault circuit interrupter. So here's the first instance, Article 210, talking about branch circuits other than dwelling units. So these areas, these rooms, need to have ground fault protection. Bathrooms, all devices in bathrooms need to have GFCI protection. Kitchens. The reason I highlight this, or areas where a sink and permanent provisions for either food preparation or cooking occurs. So typically in our hospitals, we have nutrition rooms on each patient floor. And this is not to say that the nutrition room is an area where food is prepared or cooked. It's typically stored and then distributed. So in those nutrition rooms, receptacle within 6 foot of the sink would need to be GFCI, but not all receptacles in that room would need GFCI protection. Sinks, we know that requirement. There is an exception, and I'll get into that later, out of our 517 code in the patient area. And then indoor damp and wet locations, accessory buildings, bathtubs, where it's installed within 6 foot of the edge of the bathtub and shower and stall. And we'll talk about that in a little bit too. Ground fault protection equipment requiring GFCI protection shall be provided for the receptacles. So this is interesting, new text in the code, which is highlighted in yellow. We know equipment requiring servicing, such as HVAC, needs to have a receptacle within 25 feet. It needs to be GFCI type. Indoor service equipment, the required receptacle outlet shall be located within the same room as the surface equipment and be GFCI protected. Number 2, indoor equipment requiring dedicated spaces. So in our electric rooms, you're required to have an outlet located within the same room and GFCI protected. And then I highlighted this in blue because this, I think, is significant. Essentially, the code says that the receptacle shall not be connected to the load side of the equipment's branch circuit disconnecting means. So what the code is requiring is that receptacles in an electric room be fed from a panel outside of that electric room. This is new, and I think I wanted to point that out to everybody. Article 210, branch circuits, arc flash. So arc fault has always been a requirement in guest rooms and suites, but now that requirement is extended to patient sleeping rooms in nursing homes and limited care facilities. So this is our SNFs. I put a little a lot of different language, I guess, nursing homes. So for us, SNFs are intermediate care OSHPAC 2 facilities, which is a subset of nursing homes. And the limited care facility is the same as immediate care facilities, just vocabulary that I needed to help keep myself straight. Article 240 starts talking about reconditioned equipment. With the current supply chain issues, and the other factor is the natural disasters where equipment is lately used and then put out of commission. The National Code felt it important to mention the allowances for use of reconditioned equipment. Circuit breakers, molded case circuit breakers shall not be permitted. Obviously, these are hermetically sealed and can't be reused or fixed. Low voltage and medium shall be permitted. High voltage shall be permitted. Essentially, I wanted to make everybody aware of this. If this becomes necessary to deliver projects, we will be enforcing these codes as it's written for reconditioned equipment. Article 300, exits enclosures. Where an exit enclosure is required to be separated from the building, only electric wiring messes serving equipment permitted by the authority to have jurisdiction in the exit enclosure shall be installed. So typically you'll see, egress lighting and stair enclosures, and we would generally require that penetration occurs once, and that all of the wiring for the life safety egress lighting in the stairwells rises up vertically inside of the stair enclosure. This is just for your information. Article 310 was broken up, and now there's a new Article 311, which covers the medium voltage conductors, which was previously housed in 310. Switches. So this is a significant change that affects our projects. Essentially, we are revising the OSPOD requirements so that switches shall not be installed within 3 foot of the perimeter of bathtubs or showers, stalls or showers. So previously that 5 foot, which is crossed out, was in the old code. We revised that to match the national measurement of 3 foot. And so we'll see that typically in our patient bedrooms, you can install a switch inside the room and be 3 foot away from the shower. We've had internal discussions, and our understanding of the shower is the threshold of the shower. So regardless of whether it's a shower head that can be manually operated, or the drainage system in the bathroom, or the lack of a threshold at the shower area is the threshold of the shower, and the devices would need to be outside of a distance of 3 foot from that area. Of course, nurse call devices, which are made and required to be in showers, are low voltage and UL listed for that use, so they are allowed. Receptacles, same requirement is being added now for the receptacles for the bath and shower space. Previously it was 5 foot, now it's 3 foot. It has to be 3 foot from the edge of the shower or tub or stall. You'll see on the bottom where we had our notes, so we're able to just go with the national code now. We've got rid of our OSPOD amendment. Receptacle mounting, orientation, panel boards. Essentially, I just threw this in here. Someone stumped me a while back about where's the code that disallows panel boards to be installed in a face-up position. Same with receptacles, so this is just for your information only. 408 switchboard, switchgear. So again, this is reconditioning, and the new code says panel boards shall not be permitted to be reconditioned. Switchboards and switchgear, or section of switchboards and switchgear, shall be permitted. When you look into the into the aspects of the code. This is typically, usually these are reconditioned in place. Their existing facility that has an incident and the product is damaged, and this allows that it could be rebuilt, reconditioned, and reinstalled in the same location. Switchboard, switchgear, panel board. So I feel this is significant. 408.6 always required that the switchboard, switchgear, and panel boards shall have a short circuit rating that exceeds the available short circuit current. Now the requirement is that the available fault current and the data calculations performed shall be field marked on the enclosure. So last code cycle, I believe, was when this requirement was to put it on the main service equipment. Now this requirement is expanded significantly. So once again, switchboard, switchgear, panel boards will need to have the AIC values marked. Appliances. So this again is another reference to GFCI requirements. They add bottle fill stations to the drinking water. They cord and plug connected spray washing outlets need to have GFCI protection. Vending machines, sump pumps, dishwashers, and B is just basically the GFCI will need to be readily accessible. It can be accomplished within the branch circuit over current protection device, the first outlet in a string of outlets that are connected in series, integral part of the attachment plug. So I'm going to follow on this, and I think this is fairly significant. The GFCI devices, by definition, need to be readily accessible. Number one, it says so in the code. Number two, on the face of the devices, it says to test monthly. So the installation of GFCI behind vending machines is not readily accessible. When we talk about the option of the cord with GFCI within 12 inches of the machine, that would not be readily accessible. So I think this is something we're going to have to take a look at and make sure that we take this into account during design, either with GFCI at the panel or with GFCI, just a GFCI device in line with the outlet in an accessible area. Also, when it talks about accessible, it talks about the 6 foot distance between sinks, and this description used to include without piercing a door. Door was removed, so now if we look at this description, receptacles mounted below sinks will need to have GFCI protection. It's always been a topic of, or this has frequently been a topic of discussion, but they make it very clear when they revise the definition and move for the purposes of section 1, determining the distance from receptacles, the distance shall be measured at the shortest path the supply cord of appliance connected to the receptacle would follow without piercing a floor, wall, ceiling, or fixed barrier. It used to say door, that's been removed. So if you have it under the sink and you need to go through the cabinet door, that would be within 6 foot and therefore would need to have GFCI protection. Now we're talking about generators listing. I include some of this. We're seeing more requirements for generators just with all our PS events with the new AB 2511 requirements. And so, stationary generators shall be listed. They'll have emergency shutdown. Generators other than cord and plug connected portable generators have more have one or more disconnecting means. Emergency shutdown of the prime mover is required. Remote emergency shutdown generators that are greater than 15 kW shall be provided with a remote emergency stop switch to shut down the prime mover, located outside the equipment room or generator enclosures. And then here's just another reference for GFCI for the receptacles on 15 kW generators. Transformers and vaults, always the requirement for proper ventilation was there. Essentially, the required clearances shall be clearly marked on the transformer. Typically, this is 6 inches for our dry type transformers. What's new here in yellow, and I think is significant, is the requirement that the transformer top surfaces that are horizontal, readily accessible, shall be marked to prohibit storage. So we're all aware of construction sites, and this makes a convenient table for drawings, but at the end of the job, the transformer is going to need to be cleared off, and there will need to be some type of labeling on the top of it that essentially says storage not permitted. Storage batteries. So by definition, it's expanded. Batteries, a single or group of rechargeable cells connected together electrically in series, in parallel, or a combination of both. So we are seeing more of the storage batteries going into our facilities or going into adjacent facilities that support our healthcare facilities. We are seeing that they are quite dangerous. There's been a number of incidents in regards to the batteries, and so those requirements you can find in the mechanical code as far as proper ventilation. On the electrical side, a disconnecting means is required that's readily accessible and within sight of the battery system. It goes on to say the disconnecting of series of batteries identifies battery circuits exceeding 240 volts, shall have provisions to disconnect the series strings in these segments. So there'll be, on these large battery installations, we should expect to see multiple disconnects. Notification, the disconnecting means shall be legibly marked in the field. A label with the marking shall be placed in a conspicuous location near the battery. So in general, the code is stepping up the requirements for safe battery installations. And just like the rest of our equipment, you'll need to have the available fault current calculated, identified. Arc flash label will be required. In general, the available fault current should be obtainable from the vendor. And again, just like our electric rooms, there's requirements for guarding of live parts, space around batteries, egress requirements, personnel doors that open in the direction of egress, and with listed hardware, panic hardware. So now I'm going to move on to Article 517. A lot of revisions on grammar. They added in that category 1s are critical care spaces, and the category 2s are general care spaces. You know, some I guess wordsmithing on select receptacles. Instead of calling out areas, they identify spaces, and then they add in equipment grounding conductor. So ground fault protection of equipment, where ground fault protection equipment is required, and I wanted to go over this specifically as it relates to TIO. This requirement for ground fault testing is on equipment. Equipment typically 1,000 amps and more. This is not requiring testing of GFCI receptacles, branch circuits. So where ground fault protection, we know that from 517 where ground fault protection of equipment is provided for operation of service disconnecting means, which would be Article CEC 230, which requires services over 1,000 amps to have ground fault protection, or feeder disconnects in CEC 215 over 1,000 amps need to have ground fault protection. 517 also requires the second level of ground fault protection. And so this is what this testing that's on our TIO form is addressing, and the requirements. Just as a side note, the second level ground fault protection shall not be provided on the load side of essential transfer switches. So now we are talking about the devices, ground fault protection, and this is where I wanted to go into specifically. We see from Article 210 that receptacles are required, ground fault protection receptacles are required in all bathrooms and toilet rooms. No change from what's stated here. What we do see is that receptacles located in so the receptacles in the bathrooms have ground fault. What we see in all of our facilities, hospitals, is that there are sinks out in the patient area, typically within 6 foot of the patient bed, and stationed for nurses to be able to clean their hands before and after seeing patients. So this is an exception. Ground fault circuit interrupter protection for personnel shall not be required for receptacle installed in those general care and critical care spaces where a basin sink or other similar plumbing fixtures is installed in the patient bed location. So this is one exception to the 6 foot GFCI for all receptacles within 6 foot of sinks. 5.7. So now this is potentially significant. 517.26 talks about application of other articles, and it identifies that the healthcare installations will need to comply with the requirements of Article 700 except as amended. So right here, 704, which talks about the capacity of the emergency system, is not required. We have a requirement in 517 on how to size the emergency source. Number 2, potentially very significant. It says that section 700.10D shall not apply. This is the requirement for fire protection. So this requirement is, we'll see in 710 that they removed fire protection required for healthcare facilities. They did not remove fire protection for essential feeders for high rises. But this, the way this is written, and excluding that. There's still work being done internally at HCAI with our fire protection group about survivability, but the electric code is explicitly excluding this requirement. 717 is talking about just addressing emergency lighting, and we have that. And then 700.32, which is selection coordination, is not required. So we have selective coordination requirements for other than the emergency system, like elevators and fire pumps, but we have our own requirement in 517.31G for coordination, which is a little bit more lax than the selective coordination requirement found in Article 700. Okay, sources of power. So essentially, there's revision. Well, the code allows that for emergency sources of power, generators, you'll see as provided in B2 as fuel cells, as provided in B3 is batteries. And we made clear here that all on-premise sources of power shall meet the fuel storage or battery storage duration requirements found in Article 700.12. So that requirement is 4 hours for MOBs, 6 hours for SNFs, 96 hours for hospitals, 6 hours for ambulatory care, surgery centers in MOBs. We'll find, and lots of discussion, there is a new law, new PIN 74, which increases the requirement for on-site fuel storage or provisions for operation of on-site fuel, on-site emergency power generators for SNFs. And then we just have a pointer down here about, in order to meet CMS requirements, you do need to have a generator for your emergency source. So 51730, we'll see that the fuel cell, which is an acceptable source of power for emergency power, it has a requirement that if you are using the fuel cell as an emergency power source, that a connection shall be made for a portable diesel generator to back up the life safety and critical systems. We see that as the code evolves, they've removed the requirement that fuel cells need to be listed for emergency system use. They obviously do need to be listed. The other acceptable emergency power source besides generator and fuel cells are batteries. And so this allows that batteries are acceptable means of emergency power sources. Again, there's a requirement for a portable generator that would need to be connected without modifying the existing building wiring system. And there's an informational note about NFPA 111 that has requirements for stored electrical energy for standby systems. Article 51731 has been revised. Essentially, we know that the life safety and critical branches shall be kept independent of all other wiring. Raceways, cables, or enclosures for life safety and critical branch shall be readily identified as a component of the essential electrical system. Doesn't go into detail of how to identify it, but it needs to be clearly identified. Probably something that needs to be included in specs and talked about early in the field of how this is going to be accomplished. It goes on to say boxes and enclosures, including switches, generators, power panels, shall be field or factory marked and identified as a component of the emergency electrical system. Raceways and cables shall be marked at intervals not to exceed 25 feet. So 51731 C talks about mechanical protection of the essential electrical system and states that the wiring of the life safety and critical branches shall be mechanically protected by raceways, listed flexible metal raceways, and listed metal sheath cable assemblies shall be acceptable in a number of instances. Some of those were that feed vibrating equipment, that feed modular furniture. But what we'll see is last code cycle, they added in F, which said luminaires installed in rigid structures where there is no access above the ceiling space after the luminaire is installed, that it would be acceptable to use flexible cable. Now they revised that and opened it up and said luminaires installed in ceiling structures. So essentially, what this is saying is that for our life safety and critical branch lighting circuits, that the 6-foot whips for our fixtures, whether it's a lay-in ceiling, hard ceiling, no matter what kind of construction it is acceptable. And so I think we have, this came up a number of times for interpretation in California, and it looks like it's come up across the country. So this really puts a nail in the coffin that flex is acceptable for light fixtures, regardless of what branch they're connected to. 51731. You'll see that this kind of relaxed as far as receptacle and switch identification. It used to say for the essential electrical systems. Now it's been revised to just say for life safety and critical branches. So while there's probably not a lot of equipment branch lighting and receptacles, those that do exist do not need this labeling that you have required for the critical and life safety. Typically that can be accomplished with either a red device or a red cover plate. So critical branch 51734, essentially they've added in a lot more language to say that telecommunication equipment, and telecom rooms and POEs and IDFs all should need to be circuited, have circuits for critical branch. I'll go ahead and then I'm looking at this 7A, task illumination, select receptacles and select power circuits for the following areas. Critical care or general care spaces with at least one duplex receptacle per bed location. So our critical care and general care need to have critical branch. We'll see in 517.18 that 2 circuits are required, one of which is critical branch, and then quantities of receptacles are identified there. So nothing new here. 517.34A. So here it's new and it's added that the imaging room containing imaging equipment approved by licensed agent for diagnostic services of the emergency department shall be connected to the critical branch. So not all imaging equipment is required, but there needs to be one piece of equipment that's identified to be used for operation of the emergency department, and that needs to be circuited to either the critical or the equipment branch. There's more about IT network. So this is, I guess, in our ORs with the Stryker systems, where there's a lot of IT equipment in there, would need critical branch. Talks about wireless phone and paging equipment for staff. It needs to be circuited to the critical branch. 517.35, this is the equipment branch, and we removed the OSHPD requirement where UPS is serving telephone data would need to be connected to the equipment branch, so they could be connected to critical. And as we see that their devices are required to be fed by critical, that makes this is in line with that requirement. 517.43, now we're talking about SNFs, and we see that the requirement for automatic connection to life safety and equipment branch, essentially they're removing the requirement for dining and recreation areas to have life safety lights. 517.44, essentially here they're talking about connected to the equipment branch in our SNFs. Optional connections to the equipment branch are permitted, where one switch serves multiple systems because of the size of the generator under 150 kVA, then you would need to transfer all loads within the 10 seconds as required for life safety. 517.80. So this is significant. This is an answer to the new evolution of technology for power over Ethernet lighting. And it essentially says that class 2 circuits that transmit power and data to a power device shall not be required to comply with the grounding requirements of 517.13, which is the redundant grounding, or with the mechanical protection requirements of 517.31. So that means that the power over Ethernet lighting for critical lights in the patient rooms can be utilized. And there's a reference, a pointer here that talks about there's a standard for power over Ethernet lighting services. One thing of caution I will add is that this probably there is a limit of what you can put above the ceiling that could propagate fire, and this cabling could contribute to that. So you would need to research that and probably make sure with the fire life safety officer that the amount of cabling that you're going to put in for your power over Ethernet is not going to exceed their fuel loading above the ceiling space. Temporary power. So this is from the national code. It had always said that splices, a box, conduit, or other enclosure with a cover installed shall be required for all splices. Now it's saying for temporary power, exception number 2, on construction sites, branch circuits that are permanently installed in framed walls and ceilings and are used to supply temporary power or lighting and that are GFCI protected, the following shall be permitted. Number 1, a box cover shall not be required for splices installed completely inside the junction boxes with plaster rings. So again, this is using the permanent pathway conduit and box system that's going to eventually be used for the permanent lighting, to use that temporarily as for temp power during construction is acceptable without covering the boxes. Listed pigtail type lamp holders shall be permitted. Installed in ceiling mounted junction boxes with plaster rings, again without the cover, and finger safe devices shall be permitted. So this kind of relaxes the requirements and states that temporary power is different than permanent power, and not all the codes apply equally to temporary installations. Temporary installations, ground fault protection, the assured equipment grounding conductor program shall be documented and made available. So essentially, this is a new requirement that for temp power that you have to have a program in place. This you will see on our TIO forms. So I want to make everybody familiar with this. An assured equipment grounding conductor program is OSHA and NFPA 70E requirement that ensures the safety of temp power. And essentially, this is that code reference. It requires that all equipment grounding conductors shall be tested for continuity. Each receptacle and attachment cap or plug shall be tested for correct attachment to the ground conductor. All required tests shall be performed before the first use and at intervals not to exceed 3 months. So I recommend that our contractors pay attention to this and have this paperwork on hand that this assured ground continuity testing has taken place and documented. Article 600 had a number of revisions about host signs, retrofit kits, general retrofit kits. So essentially, the code writing committees felt this was important to address. Signs with a retrofitted system, the markings, listing labels shall be visible after installation, shall be permanently applied in a location visible prior to servicing. So it's basically just saying that the labeling for these signs and retrofit need to be visible. Branch circuits, a disconnecting means for sign or controller shall be marked to identify the sign that it controls, similar to what we saw for the disconnects. If the disconnect is obvious, attached to the sign, then it would not need labeling. Article 620, a couple of new revisions for ground fault circuit protection. Each essentially all the receptacles and pits, hoistways, cars shall be ground fault type. A receptacle shall be installed in machine spaces. Permanently installed sump pumps shall be wired with ground fault protection. So just pointing this out. This is something new, to me at least. 62022 car light receptacles, auxiliary lighting for the elevators. Essentially, they're saying a separate, not dedicated, a separate branch circuit shall be supply the car lights. The car lights branch circuit shall be permitted to supply receptacles. So I think that's new. Accessory equipment, etc. Where then it talks about the overcurrent protection for the protecting the branch circuit shall be located in the elevator machine room. For our machineless elevators, the disconnect will need to be outside of the hoistway and accessible to qualified personnel only. So probably in the basement or on the roof. Article 625 starts to talk about electrical vehicle power export. This E2V concept, essentially where these electric cars can be used as mobile batteries. So we'll see this electrical vehicle power export equipment, including the outlet of the vehicle that is used to provide electric power at voltage greater or equal to 30 volts, using the vehicle as a source of supply. So this is new technology, and the code is evolving to address that. It talks about the rating. The power transfer equipment shall have sufficient ratings to supply load serve. The service and feeder shall be sized in accordance with the product ratings. So this is going to be specific to each project, which equipment you're going to have either the car charging station equipment available, and use that for your calculations of your feeders, or base it on a certain manufacturer and include that in your design. Interactive systems, electric vehicle charging stations that incorporate a power export function that is part of the interacting system. So essentially, it is part of the interactive system that serves as an optional standby system. An electric power production source or a bidirectional power feed shall be listed and marked for that purpose. When used as an optional standby system, the requirements of Article 702 shall apply. That's the standby power requirements. If it's used as an electric power production source, Article 705 will apply. And the electrical vehicle that consists of a receptacle outlet shall be in accordance with 625. So essentially, the code is evolving to take into account that these electrical vehicle charging stations can be used for bidirectional power flow. Solar voltaic systems. So essentially, it's stating inverters, generators, PV modules, combiners, converters, all need to be listed and evaluated for application, listed for the use, or be evaluated for the use and application in the field. So typically we see people keeping the solar and battery installations and having a demarc point, so that what's submitted to HCAI is only the connection for these devices. But as the code continues to evolve and PVs and fuel cells are acceptable emergency power sources, those designs, if they're intended for that use, will need to be submitted and reviewed by HCAI. We'll see that the national code is continuing to stay on top of requirements for these systems. So solar voltaics needs, rapid shutdown, control limiters, initiating device equipment. We see that for disconnecting means, the PV system disconnecting means shall be installed at a readily accessible location, and shall be able to be where disconnecting means above 30 volts are readily accessible to unqualified persons. Any doors would need to be locked. We'll see that, identification. So if the PV systems are standalone system, plaques are required. If they're part of the, with utility services and PV systems, plaques are required. So essentially, the solar PV system is equipped with rapid shutdown. It's a safety. So essentially, if you have PVs or fuel cells, we need to make it clearly evident that if firefighters are on the scene and want to disconnect power, they need to go to other places other than the main disconnect or the main service. Fuel cell system 692, this is continuing to evolve. Identification of power sources, again, the same safety requirements for identifying that there's an alternate source that is connected to the utility source. Listing requirements, same as we saw for the PV systems. And again, the fuel cell systems have a unique situation where they might be disconnected but still generating power. So it's required to have a label that electric shock could, that the terminals could still be hot even though the output breaker is open. Fire pumps, essentially it gives the exception, for the 2-hour protection of the fire pump wiring, so that inside the room, that's a 2-hour rated room that houses a fire pump, that's not a requirement. Article 700, dimmer relay systems. So essentially, this is talking about, emergency power. You can't turn off completely emergency lights or the life safety branch lights for exiting. You can dim, and if you're sensing the normal source and then returning to full brightness, which is a requirement of 700, it talks about how to do the connection. So if you're using a control bypass function where the dimmer relay is fed by the normal and emergency source, which is downstream of a transfer switch, then the sensing shall be permitted from a normal only power source, which would give you a true reading of the utilities power availability. Storage batteries, we've identified they can be part of the emergency system, and here in 700 we're just reiterating that the sizing and the rating would need to meet the duration specified in 712D, which we discussed. And that concludes my presentation. I'm going to go ahead and open it up for questions.
Jamie, thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. So let's start to go through some questions. We have 30 minutes approximately, so let's try to go through the questions as much as we can. And of course, if we miss some of your question, please send the email to the email that you see on the screen to rexunit@hcai.ca.gov. So that being said, let's start with the question. The first question reads, is part 6 for people hooking up to charging station 2 with EVs to send power into a building?
So the code is definitely, yes, the code is, I'm not familiar with the part 6 specifically, but the code is Oh yeah, that's in the beginning. So yes, that part 6, which is now in the code, is looking at electrical vehicles as batteries. So yes.
Thank you. Next question reads, is sprinkler pipe 6-inch within the top of the dedicated electrical space allowed?
So sprinkler pipe is not allowed in the dedicated electrical space. The 6-inch measurement, I'm not sure where that's coming from. You're welcome to ask me directly, but the code requirement is that nothing is allowed in the dedicated electric space, which is essentially over top of electric equipment, up to 6.5 feet or to the structure above.
Got it. Thank you. Next question says, can transformers be stacked for HCAI? And first of all, before you answer, Jamie, when somebody asks for HCAI, we follow the code. So it's not for us, but it's per code. So if I may rephrase this question is, can transformer be stacked?
Yes. There's no provisions that prohibit that. The vendor has requirements for air circulation as long as that's met. There's seismic, structural requirements for transformers, but there is no movable parts that need to be accessed. So that height for access of overcurrent protection device doesn't come into play. They can be stacked.
Thank you. Thank you, Jamie. Next question, are there new items for lithium ion yet?
Are there new items for lithium ion?
Lithium ion.
I would ask that individual to email me directly. I mean, lithium ion batteries, I don't know what that refers to. That there are other codes that address the hazards of batteries and fluids and different types of battery systems. So I apologize. I don't think I can answer that question here.
And always, again, if there is something that needs to be continue to be clarified, that is the email. We strongly recommend to send email to rexunit@hci.ca.gov, and Jamie and the team will answer to your question. Next question reads, discuss the new 410.118 access to other boxes. Luminaires recessed in ceilings, floors, or walls shall not be used to access outlet, pull or junction boxes, or conduit bodies unless the box or conduit body is an integral part of the listed luminaire. We have heard that if any existing fixture with this condition is touched in construction, it needs to be corrected. Or would all existing conditions within a project need to be corrected?
So this would be something you'd have to work out with your compliance officers, but the general rule is that new work that's put in place needs to be code compliant. I'm not familiar with this particular project and what you're running into, but we should be enforcing that new work needs to be code compliant.
Thank you, Jamie. Next question reads, there are good questions. Next question is 517.31, marking of life safety and critical branch conductors. We'd assume this includes underground feeders and also assume the 20 feet interval will not be required of conductor in raceway within more than 20 feet between boxes. Is this assumption correct?
Yeah, so obviously the labeling is for what can be seen. So you're not required to label underground conduits that are going to be buried. As it comes into a box, that would need to be labeled as it continues from there. I think the confusing part, and I was trying to puzzle through this myself, why it says conduits and wires. And I think that this is just trying to address the wiring systems such as AC cable, MC cable. And so obviously, your emergency wires are gonna, they're gonna originate in an emergency board, which is labeled. They're going to run through conduit, which has labeling. They're going to end up in a box or a panel board that has labeling. So I think when they say labeling and wiring, it's talking about the AC and MC cables.
Got it. Thank you,
Hope that
Jamie.
answers your question.
And if it's not, again, send the email to Rex Unit and we will go through. Next question is 590.6, temporary installation. Is the intent of the TIO item B-E14 temporary installation grounding to provide the paperwork for the assured equipment grounding conductor program?
Not for, it's for the temporary power grounding. It's the paperwork is to ensure that the temporary grounding system, the temporary power system is checked for ground continuity and on the initial installation, and then I think it said every 3 months. So it's explicitly for the temp power systems.
Thank you. Let's continue. Question reads 517.19, category 1, critical care spaces. A, patient bed location branch circuit. Each patient bed location should be supplied by at least 2 branch circuit, one or more from the one or more from the critical branch and one or more circuit from the normal system. So I don't know, this is reading the code, so I don't understand if there is a specific, there is a continuation, so sorry, because the person brought the question in 2 parts. This is not a code change, but we understand that there is an HCAI policy change, as there are several hospitals which have equipment branch receptacle rather than normal or optional standby receptacle at the patient bed location. We understand this is no longer approvable and it does not meet the model code. Can you confirm?
Yeah, here, give me a second. So let me take a shot at this real quick. Please go ahead and send that to me via an email. I'm not, the model code is what we enforce. We don't have any branch circuit serving only special order.
So we recommend send the email.
Yeah, I'm sorry. So we do have an exception that says critical care category 1 spaces served from 2 separate critical branch transfer switches shall not be required to have circuits from the normal system. So the idea is that you have, redundant power path, redundant pathways. And so I guess for that one, if I can read that a little bit more. I'm not sure about equipment circuits going to patient beds. I'm not familiar with that. So again, just like we said, we're only enforcing code. And if you see that you feel like we're not enforcing the code as it's written, please bring that to our attention. We're not trying to have any HCAI special requirements. We certainly have California amendments, which we will enforce because that's code, but we're really trying to eliminate any kind of special interpretations that don't match the code. So I will, please send that to me directly as an email, and I'll try to get you a good answer for that.
Thank you. Thank you, Jamie. I want to let everybody know we have 20 minutes left. The next question is short circuit label on panel required for new and existing or for new panel only?
It's, so that's a really good question. If you're, obviously for new work, yes, it's required. That's what the code says. So the question is, I'm assuming, hey, I'm extending a circuit from an existing panel. Do I need to go back and label that? And essentially, that's a really good question. Let me take some time and I'll send that out and answer to the entire group. The intent is that the new work follows the code. The code requires short circuit ratings. Obviously, if you're doing anything that's going to affect the short circuit rating, if you're adding motors, if you're adding transformers or adding, like we talked about, supplementing the normal power service with distributed energy resources, you would need to go ahead and go do the calc and label it. But I'm not assuming that we're going to require that you have to do that for every single panel that you touch. So
that makes sense. That makes sense. Thank you, Jamie. Thank you. Continuing, there are many questions, so let's try to figure it out if we can.
It's good.
We have the time.
We got done early so we can answer questions.
Right.
Appreciate this time with everybody.
We're trying our best. Next question reads, for GFCI protection, if the vending machine needs GFCI protection and accessible, does this mean we need to provide GFCI breakers?
Yeah, for it to be accessible, I think we could all be I hope we could all be in agreement that if it's behind, the GFCI receptacles on the label say they should be tested monthly. And the idea is that, you're protecting the public from a ground fault. And in order to be readily accessible, it could be at the breaker. That would be a great solution. You can also provide GFCI devices that basically look like a switch, in a 4-square box that then feed the receptacle, and they could be pulled out on the side of the machines, where they could be accessed. So I see 2 options to meet that code requirement.
Got it. Thank you. Next question reads, and this is very common. Does the electrical code still dictate the height of nurse call device height? This was previously in conflict with the grab bar requirements in a restroom where mounting of the device is 3 to 4 feet floor to floor, to the finished floor.
That's a great question. We have revised the code that allows for the alternate height for the nurse call device based on the grab bar. I went through that a little while ago, and I will add that to our frequently asked questions on our website, because that's a really good question. But the code has been revised, which permits receptacles at a different height when there's conflict with the grab bar.
Awesome. Thank you, Jamie. Next question reads, does the transformer have dedicated space requirement on top?
No, it just needs ventilation space requirements.
Thank you. Next question, is GFI switch allowed to protect the receptacle serving equipment?
A GFCI switch?
Mhm.
Yes, yes, absolutely. That's kind of what I was talking about, where you pull out the GFCI device separate from the receptacle.
Right. Thank you. Thank you. Next question. There are good questions. Next question is, do transformer require 6-foot dedicated clear vertical space above the equipment?
Oh, that's a common question, huh? So I'm gonna take a minute and read the code to you guys. That says no, but if it's being asked a lot, remember.
Perfect. So in the meantime, while Jamie, you look for the best answer to provide. So we have 15 minutes left. And again, if we are running out of time and you have questions, we keep repeating it because it's needed. Please email to rexunit@hci.ca.gov. So please remember to send the emails to us. If we didn't answer to your question now, if you have a specific project question, just email us.
Okay, so the California Electric Code 110.26E, dedicated equipment space. All switchboards, switchgear, panel boards, and motor control centers shall be located in dedicated spaces and protected from damage. Indoor, so we're talking switchboards, switchgear, panel boards, and MCCs. And then indoors, dedicated electrical space. The space equal to the width and depth of the equipment and extending from the floor to a height of 6 foot above the equipment or to the structural ceiling, whichever is located, shall be dedicated to the electrical installation. No piping, ducts, leak protection apparatus, or other equipment foreign to the electrical installation shall be located in this zone. So to answer the question about is this required over transformers? The answer is no. To answer the question about am I allowed to have a sprinkler piping that's at 6 foot 6 inches above the equipment, that is code permissible. I would recommend that you have a drip pan so that you don't have the issue of water getting on your electric equipment, but it's not a code requirement.
Thank you, Jamie.
I mean, I'll say this, let me keep it going. Foreign systems, the area above the dedicated space required to be kept clear shall be permitted to contain foreign systems provided protection is installed to avoid damage to the electrical equipment from condensation, leaks, or breaks. So the answer is yes, you could have that installed, but when I said you should, it actually code requires that you provide protection to avoid leaks. If you have fire sprinkler pipe over 6, at 6 foot 6 inches above your equipment. Hope that answers the question.
Thank you, Jamie. Next question, and we have approximately 10 minutes left. Are there any modification to 760 fire alarm system or modification related to fire alarm that we should be aware of?
Nothing comes to mind. I would go through the code thoroughly, but I didn't see anything that stuck out. No.
Thank you. Next question, can a transformer be installed above the panel it serves within the dedicated panel space? Would it violate the code section 110.26.3?
Yeah, that would be a code violation.
Short and sweet. Thank you, Jamie. Next question. Have you heard of any solution to the HCAI requirement for vending machine in alcoves?
Yeah, the GFCI switch that's on the side wall that you can easily reach, and then that feeds the receptacle. That would give GFCI protection to the receptacle that could be tested monthly.
Thank you. Next question. You mentioned PoE lighting when you reviewed the 517-80. Would you confirm that the 517-80 also applies to DC LV lighting that not PoE?
Let me see. Gosh, I guess everybody's. So it says class 2 and class 3 signaling communication circuits that transmit power and data to a power device and power limited fire alarm systems shall not be required to comply with the grounding requirements. So can you read the question again?
Yes, of course. You mentioned PoE lighting when you reviewed the 517-80. Would you confirm that 517-80 also applies to DC LV lighting that not PoE?
It doesn't appear that that's what this code is saying. It says class 2 circuits that transmit power and data.
Mm-hmm.
So it doesn't sound like that meets this definition. So nope, but it's something I can certainly look into.
Thank you, Jamie. Next question. So the GFCI receptacle in elevator pits would need to be accessed every month to test?
That's a good question. And same for the sump pump. So yes.
Thank you. We are almost done with the time and with the question. Next question reads, is there any difference or clarification in the code between battery storage system and UPS system?
That's a good question. So, there is emergency electric storage systems. So I can't think of any. It's an interesting question. I'll have to study that because the code really doesn't use the word UPS very often when it's talking about battery storage.
True. And so you can follow up. Please that
You're
person
welcome,
to send
send me a direct email and I'll try to walk through. I'm not sure what how that would fly, but let me know what the concern is.
That makes sense. Thank you, Jamie. Next question reads, can all lighting wiring be flex?
No.
Thank you.
So sorry. The life safety and critical is required to have it to be mechanically protected. So that wiring is required to be in hard pipe. The 6-foot flex from the last J box to the fixture itself is acceptable for is accepted in the code to not be required for mechanical protection, but that's just it. Just the last 6 foot from the J box to the device to the fixture itself.
Thank you, Jamie. Next question reads, based on HCAI PIN 70, does the electrical code have any revision on providing selective coordination and TCC for existing spare emergency circuit breaker that has been utilized in new projects?
No. We just added that one definition in there.
Thank you. Thank you. And we have 5 minutes left. Next question reads, what is the required accessible space for low voltage equipment? Code section 101.26.
Well, if it has a 120 volt breaker, it would be, you know, it would be that 3 foot clearance. So typically what we see is low voltage panels have 120 volt source. And if it has an overcurrent protection device, that would drive the access space. I'm not aware of any equipment that doesn't have that would be low voltage. So again, if you have a unique installation that you want me to take a look at, go ahead and send that to me.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jamie. Few more questions. The next one reads, can inverter battery be used as a source of power for emergency lighting?
So can a integral battery be used for lightings?
Emergency lighting.
Not in our hospitals. It's required to have an alternate source, and that would be the life safety branch.
Thank you. And the next one reads, do storage batteries on open racks require an OSP?
Yes. Yep, the whole system would need to have an OSP.
Thank you. For OSHPD 1 facilities, the lighting switch low voltage that has multiple switch legs for normal and emergency power has to be separated per power source?
Correct. Yeah, 700, Article 700 is pretty clear that you would need to have, you can't, the only place where you can combine normal and emergency would be in a transfer switch, in a light fixture. So yes, that would need to be separate.
Wonderful. Thank you. 2 more questions and then we will be done. And thank you so much. So the next question reads, do batteries on open rack require a 2-hour 5-rated battery room, or can the open battery racks be installed behind a chain link fence with accessible gate? If so, does the gate need to have panic or listed fire exit hardware?
You know what? Send that in and I'll get that to our fire marshal.
Makes sense. Thank you, Jamie. Last question reads, are light switches and receptacle connected to the equipment branch in hospitals still allowed to be red in color, similar to the life safety and critical branch?
Yes, they're allowed, but they're not required.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So thank you, Jamie, for the wonderful presentation, wonderful questions. To all, if you need to re-listen this webinar, it will be available to you in about 3-4 weeks. You will find this recorded webinar and the handout on the HCAI website. You will go under the Building Safety Finance. You will click on Forums, Training and Resources. There you will find multiple windows. The first one, there will be the training education, has on the bottom left the word webinars, and you will click there and you will scroll until you will find the 2022 California Electrical Code webinar, and you will find this webinar recorded, and you will find also the handout. Please remember, if you have a project-specific question, send those questions over to the regs unit at hcai.ca.gov that you saw for a long time on our screen. Subscribe for future presentation and notification. And so to do that, you will go to our website, www.hcai.ca.gov. Upper right, you will click subscribe, provide your name, email address, and select what area you would like to be notified about. For example, building safety and financing, design and construction. It's been a pleasure being with all of you today. Thank you. Thank you for what you do and for doing your part in providing access to safe, quality healthcare environment throughout the state of California. Until the next time, thank you so much. Bye.